Hello and welcome back. The other chapter we wanted to talk about today was to talk about actions. So in the actions chapter, when we get to the end of this module, we're going to talk about defining and using actions. We're going to understand the order of precedence of the action attributes, how those actions appear on the screen, and we'll define and use our action defaults file. So when it comes to interfacing with the user, you give the user the ability to have actions, and those actions are going to trigger something. So actions are events that are triggered by interactive elements in the program. You've turned control over to the user. These actions are then transmitted to the runtime system so that they can interpret it. And actions are managed by action views and by action handlers. When we talk about an action view, we're talking about the graphical objects on a screen that are associated with the action. So they can be buttons, they can be toolbars, they can be top menu commands. We saw the double-click attribute. It can be control keys. They're the buttons in the default panel versus buttons that we put on the screen. Any way that the user is able to interact, that is an action view. Action view tends to be the graphical object, so we're really talking about things like buttons, things like toolbars, things like top menus. And the reason we want to concentrate on them as action views is because you sometimes like to decorate views in a way that's pleasing to you, in a way that's pleasing to your users. So when we get into action defaults, we're talking about the different ways you want those views to appear, allowing the user to then go and select it to trigger that action. The action handler is defined with the onAction clause. So the action handler is a set of instructions. The action handler is my onAction accept, onAction delete, and they are used with interactive dialogues, with menu statements, input array, construct, and display array statements. And when the user selects an option, that action view is going to trigger the action event, which executes the code that is inside of the action handler. So those are just the terms. We have the action view, the action event, and the action handler. A lot of what we're going to be looking at today is going to be how do we influence that action view. So the front end creates a default action view. I'm going to actually add a little note to my slide here to add a bit more information about the order. Order of code. So the default action view, so if there's no explicit defined, if there's no toolbar button, if there's no button, that's where we get into our default action view. We call this the action panel. So if you've just said, I want to display and I want to quit, and you don't provide us any more information about how you want that decorated, we put it out there inside of an action panel. It says typically because you can overwrite this. You can specify specific styles that direct this, but by default, out of the box, we have an action panel that we use to display those actions that you haven't redefined elsewhere. And it's for each menu command statement or for each onAction clause. Now, if you print down or download the PDF that I've included in today's class bundle, inside of the text underneath this slide, we do talk about if you have an on key or if you have a command key, those don't have a graphical or action view. Those don't have a graphical component. So those don't appear here, and the user just has to know the key combination. And then if one or more action views are explicitly defined for a given action, the front end considers that the default view is no longer needed. And we saw that with the update button. When we set a double click equal to update, the front end interpreted that as no longer needing the update button in my action panel, and it removed it. So if we want to override that, then we're going to have to go in and explicitly state to put that update action there, and we're going to see how to do that on the next slide. So controlling the default action view visibility. So we have a property or an attribute out there called defaultView. And just for those of you that maybe use or not experienced with Studio much yet, when you're working with per files, we call them attributes. And if you look in the BDL documentation, they're called attributes. So defaultView is an attribute that you would set on inside of your per file. When we went into Studio, they changed them to properties. So I will have properties out here in Studio. Let me open up my form. I have properties on my form. So there we go. So here's my form. I have the properties here. These are also what were known as attributes inside of the per file. So one of the properties that we can set up on a form is to have action defaults. So I'm going to go ahead and add an action default list here. By default, you'll see there is no action default list set up. If I want to add a default list, let me go ahead and execute my application. I just want to make sure if I execute it right now, I have no update button because I've set the double click to be my update. What I can do is I can say, well, no, I always want the update to appear, and the way I do that is I can go into my form and I can add an action default list. I can add an action default, and that action default, I can say, well, the name is for update. For this update action, I want to go ahead and by default, it's going to do what it automatically does. Automatically, it says if my update is handled somewhere else, I'm not going to put it in that action panel. If I want to force it to appear in my default view, in my action panel, I'm going to change this to yes. So if there's an update, yes, I want it inside of my default regardless of if it's somewhere else. Let me save this. Let me compile the form. And let me see if I've done this correctly. If I execute, now you can see my update button has appeared again. So I still have my double click, but because I've said I want that default to be there, I've defined it inside of my form. I said if there's an update, the default view must appear. I've set the default view attribute equal to yes. So you can set this default view. I set it individually in the form. If I was in a per file, I would see an action default section. I showed you how to make that same thing happen inside of Studio. You could also set it globally in what we call a 4AD file. And by the end of this chapter, you're going to know what a 4AD file is, and it's the global action defaults file. So I could say my update will always appear across any of the forms being displayed by my application by setting it up globally in that 4AD file. Okay, action binding. So inside of our, I'm sorry my circle's off here, but inside of our dialog, we add something like on action print. So lowercase print. It could also be uppercase print. Our compiler takes your action names and converts them all to lowercase so that we don't have a capitalization or a uppercase lowercase issue. So on action print, wherever it hits print, we now need to bind that to my action view. If you were using a per file, so here we say I'm going to create a button. The button's name is B1, but we have the colon there, and it's the name associated is going to be print. So this is what's associating this print action with this button that we put on the form. Now on Form Designer, went the wrong way. In Form Designer, we put our button on the form, and one of the first properties we have is the name. And here is where we would put the name of the action. So if I wanted to add a button to my form, let's handle this update again. So I'm going to, let me cancel out of this. If I've gone and I want to add a button to my form, place a button on the form. I change the name of the button from button to update. I save my change. I compile my form. Then I execute. I now have it says button 1 down here. Notice the text didn't change of the button, but when I click on it, it puts me in update mode. If I wanted that name of the name that appears on the button to change, I would go to my button, I'd scroll down my list, and here I have my text. So here's where I can enter whatever I want to enter to be my button name, or to be the label that appears on the button. Again, compile my file, execute my application, and now you can see it lists what I've defined the text to be for that button, and it puts me in the mode. So one of the things I find that people do have issues with when they first start working inside of Studio is they go and they look at this button, and really when you put the action name is what you put inside of that name attribute. And if I added additional buttons to the form and I gave them additional action names, I would expect those action names to disappear from my default action view, unless I've gone in there and I've made it so that I force that action to always appear in that default action view. Next action thing I want to talk about is the predefined actions. So Genero does predefine action names for common operations. And we saw that inside of our editable display array. We saw that the display array itself had an OK and a cancel. And then when you did insert, delete, append, and update, those were triggered for you because these statements made those names appear. You also saw that there were some default actions out there like find and find next, kicked off those the built-in search. So there's a couple things that we would want to do here. One is you want to find out what the predefined actions are. And what I want to show you here is if I go inside of Studio and if I click on my help icon so I can get to my contextual help. If I did a search, I can search for, let's see, default actions, I'll call it, default actions. I do my search. One thing about our search inside of the product help is it's searching across all documents. So I'm looking down. I want the FGL document. So I'm going to go down and wait until I get into here. So here, default actions in a construct statement, default actions in a display array statement. If I click on these topics, here's where you can see all of the default actions that are created when you have a display array statement. All of these are handled somehow, but they're all being created for you. Are they all appearing by default? Depends. So like the next row, it only created if the display array is used with a screen record having only one row. The find, it's only created if you allowed a built-in find. We have the accept and the cancel. So these are the names. If you wanted to place buttons on the form, you want to know what the action names are. This is where I would go to find out what they are for the display array. This is where I would go to find out. If I'm in an input statement, I basically have accept, cancel, close, and help. Those are my 4 default actions. If I was in a construct statement, same 4. Input array would have a lot more that I can work through. So the display and input array have a lot more. My dialog, you're going to find, has a lot more that I can work with. This is where I would go to find out what the default action names are. And then default actions and keyboard shortcuts, they're defined in this this global action default files, this default.4ad file. Let me go and look at that file for you. So if I go into my Studio, I'm going to go into File Browser, and let me go and locate my programs, my 4GL. I have Studio, 250, FGL, and I believe it said lib, correct? Default.4ad. If I open it up, here is my action default list. And so this is where it's defining what by default every action in my system is going to use in its action view unless I override it. So, for example, my accept, the text is always going to be OK unless I override it. If I hit the return key or the enter key, those are two accelerator keys that will also trigger that OK action. And then context menu is equal to no. That means that if I think the context menu is my right click, so it's not going to appear if I do a right click. We have a slide where we walk through what these different attributes are. But the contextual is the right click menu. And all of these are talking about different things. You'll see that there's images that you can do. There's bubble comments. If you hover over it, what bubble comment is going to appear up. Inside of this default.4ad file, this is the one that we give you. You can, of course, modify it here. We're going to recommend you create your own copy and modify your own copy so that if you go and upgrade, you're not overriding the copy that we provide. And that's what I had to say about this. So you know now that there is a default.4ad file. This default.4ad file is the file that is used if you haven't specified another action defaults file. So the purpose of our action file is for consistency. You typically have one person or a team that manages your action default file. If you're a company and you're building a lot of applications, you want a consistent look and feel across all of your applications. You do that by centralizing your action views inside of this action default file. That way a programmer isn't going out there and putting in their own flair or their own twist on what they think an action view should look like. It's going by a company standards that's set up in a default file that you provide. So you're centralizing your decoration of your action views. You can include text, comments, images, accelerator keys, and more. We'll go over that later. So action defaults, they can be defined in the form file itself. You saw me affect that when I went and I added an action default list to the form for the update example I gave you earlier. Or you can do it in an external file. Now, if you do it at the form level, the issue that we're going to have here is that each form can end up being different. So if developers are going in, creating their forms, and then putting in their action defaults within their forms, you can end up with a wide disparity of how these action views are looking between one form to the next. The recommended way for consistency is to go ahead and define an external action defaults file. An action default file, it's an XML file. It has an extension of .4ad. We provide our default, FGLDIR/lib.default.4ad, but you can create your own action default file. And we'll take a look at that in a few minutes. So just talking about action views, where we're putting these action decorations on, you can set it at the actual element label. So here we have a button B1. It's going to be a print, and we're giving it text of print record. We're defining what that looks like on the button itself. You can put it in the form. I added for you. I showed you adding the action default list. What I wanted to keep on this slide is if you have not added an action default list, you're allowed to import action defaults. So I could go to a form. I could right-click on my form. I could right-click on that node. I could select Import Action Defaults, and it would import it from a file. Not 100% sure why you would do this. If you have an action default file, why not let the action default file handle it outside of your form? But if you wanted to pull in stuff and then make modifications, maybe this form just needs some specific modifications, that's a way you can do it. On this slide, I wanted to show you, for those of you still working in per files, working in text-based files, they're showing how you can how you would put your action default file inside of your per file. So I could say my action is print. I could give it the comment, the accelerator. I could give it the text. I could define everything inside of here. so that I could just have a button that says print, and that a button whose name is print, yet have it pick up all the information from this action default. And the third step is to have the file. The file is how I see people doing it mostly nowadays. So when you're defining an action default file, you either create a copy of the default.4ad or you have Studio generate one for you. You can, in the example or the class we did today, you can save it inside of your current directory. And when it goes to look for action default files, it's going to first look inside of the current directory. So it'll look where your compiled files are. If it's not finding it inside of that current directory, it's going to go and look in the directories that are specified by the DBPATH or the FGURESOURCEPATH environment variables. As soon as it finds one, it stops there. So it can be if it's located across multiple directories, it's going to stop when it finds the first one. And then if it doesn't find any there, it's going to use the one we provide out of the box, the default action default file that's inside of your FGLDIR/lib directory. I want to show you about creating the action default then. So if I go into Studio, let's say I want a new action default file, so I have my project. I'm inside of a library. I could go and I could say File, New. It's a Genero. It's an action defaults I'm trying to do, so it's underneath Design. Let's see, is it under Genero too? Yeah, under my Genero files, I can say action default. When I say OK, it goes out there and it's going to pre-populate it with some of the things that it knows that you kind of want to have. So it went out there and it pre-populated, provided this for me. I could go ahead and make changes if I wanted to. So instead of OK, I wanted to say, you know, this is great. I can make my changes. To any of these images, I can add things if I need to. So if I wanted to say, what was the one? Default view. Default view equals, yes, I always want this to appear inside of a default view. I could add that in. And then I could save it. So when I save it, I can give it a name, so I'm just going to call it my defaults here. I'm doing this because I already have a default.4ad that I've been using for other things, but if I want to call it my defaults, it's created. Oh, I thought I would put it in the library. Let me add it to the library. Okay, I created something called my defaults. Okay, I'm not sure where I've just saved this to, but let me try another save again. Let me get to my file here. Let me make a change. Boom. I want to save it again. It's insert in the file. Oh, inside I put it in another class. Sorry. Let me delete it from there. Boom. And now let me add it up here. Add file. So it wouldn't let me add this file twice inside of my project, but now I have it there. Sorry about that. Read your dialogues before you click OK. So now I have this out here, and I've created some changes to this my defaults.4ad. Now, if I execute this application, any of these applications, it's not going to use my defaults.4ad, because if we look at this side right here, it's looking for a default.4ad file. So it's going to go through and it's going to find the first default.4ad it comes across, and it's going to use that. I got a question asking about if are default files cumulative, and the answer is no, they are not cumulative. The system is going to search for a single default 4ad file. Once it finds a 4ad file, it stops looking elsewhere. So you really want your action default file to be to cover everything that you could possibly want it to cover. And that's typically why you have a team that, or a person that maintains your action defaults. And use that one action default across all your applications, because you don't want that OK button to look different between one application and the next. And if the action default file contains actions that are not relevant to the application or form you're working with, it doesn't matter. If it's not relevant, then that action is not going to be displaying on the form. The only time that action view appears is if you're in a dialog statement that makes that action view necessary. So let me see if I do on the next slide. Okay, so here's the, so I've created a file out there. I called it my defaults. I want that file to be used. How do I make that being used? I end up using a class method called ui.Interface.loadActionDefaults. So if I call this guy ui.Interface.loadActionDefaults, it's going to use my action default file instead of going out there and try to find a default.4ad file. So let me just test this out. So if I go out here and I've created my defaults.4ad, I think it's looking okay. Why does it not like, oh, let me get rid of that. Boy, I'm introducing errors all over the place. So there we go. Let me put my, okay, so this needing to do correct XML, of course, is important. I've got my stuff defined here. It's called my defaults. Let me go into my program. In order for me to get this to used, inside of my main module, I'm going to want to set my action default. So I'm going to do my call, UI dot, and here you can see my wizard popping up, interface dot load action defaults. So I can type in an L to get to load action defaults. And then I need to give it the name of the file. And it was my defaults. You notice I don't put an extension on because it knows what it's looking for. Let me see if I did this correctly and I get this to work. I've saved my changes. I compile my file. And now the live demo that I didn't try before, running this today. Yeah, and it's great. It works. So I can see it no longer says OK. It says this is great. I had also added that the insert must appear, but there's nothing really to check that against. Let me go ahead and add a button to my form. So let me cancel out of this. I go into my form. Let me add another button. This button I was going to call insert. I'm going to label it insert. Let me change the text. So it says insert. Okay, that all looks good. I'll save it. I'll compile the file. And then let me run it again, execute my application again. I have the insert, but my insert is still appearing because I told it to inside of my 4AD file. If I go back into my default.4AD file, let me take out where I forced it to appear. Take out my default view. Didn't introduce any XML errors. That's good. Let me run this again. You see now my insert has disappeared because I have the button that does it and I'm not forcing it to display. So what are the attributes that you can set up inside of your action default file? So the first, you have the name, and that's where you're putting in the action name. It's tradition to enter them in lowercase. You can enter them in uppercase. It'll be changed to lowercase for you. I just say use lowercase. That's where it's going to end up going through, and you don't cause any confusion. You can then identify the text, and that's the default label to be used, such as the text of the button. You can provide a comment. Comment is typically displayed as bubble help, so when I hover over the button, when the little bubble pops up, that tells me whatever you have put in this comment. If it supports an image, you can add the image to the action view. And then we have up to 4 accelerators you can define. Excuse me. And these are what accelerator keys can trigger the action. Context menu. Should the action appear in the context when you right-click on the menu? And the default is yes. So you'll have seen a lot of ours, when you generate the file, it's actually explicitly put in, set the context menu to no, because they don't want OK to appear in the no. So let me just execute this application. I want just to have this application. So they're talking about when you right-click, find next, things like that. That's what they mean by, these are the actions that are when they talk about a context menu. We have the default view. Must the front end show this in the ring menu or in the action panel? It's auto by default. We've shown you how to set it to yes. Notice you can also always force it to never be there by setting it equal to no. The last one is validate. If by default validation is on, you can apparently set validate equal to no. And that's where you're saying you don't want any of the data that may have been put in to be validated before kicking off the action. I've never really had an opportunity to use this, but it does exist. I've added it to the slide. It wasn't on the slide previously. I added it on the slide today because there must be a reason for it to exist. I just haven't found a reason to actually want to use it yet. If you wanted to find out more about these, so action default attributes, you could, let's see what happens if we type that in. So action default attributes, here's the list that's put out there of what their different values are. You can also go, here's where it talks about the action default section inside of your 4AD file. And you'll notice it gives you links out there to all of these different items. So if you wanted to find out more about default view, I could go and read through the text about the default view. So any questions you have about how to use these or how they're implemented inside of that 4AD file, you can go to the documentation to read about it and find out what the acceptable values are, what kind of things you can enter into these as different attributes. Okay, just as far as precedence of action view attributes. So I said there was only a single 4AD file. We're looking at one action default file. But what if you have an action default file and you've defined things within the button itself? So the precedence is if you defined it on the item, if you've defined it on the element, of course that's going to win. So if you're explicitly saying you want the button to say this is great, then the button is going to say this is great. After that, we look at the form. Have there been things defined for the form? If they are, those are going to be those can be applied. And then if it hasn't been defined for the element, if it hasn't been defined for the form, that's where we pull it from the action defaults file. And we're pulling it from one and only one action defaults file. So there is some precedence. The precedence is it on an element? If it's not, then we look at the form. If it's not, then we look at the default file. And that ends the discussion or the chapter we have about views or setting up actions and setting up action views. Do we have any questions out there about the actions chapter? Where did my people go? Okay, looking, I don't see any hands out there right now. I want to take a few minutes then and talk a little bit about the lab exercise that we're going to be doing, I'm going to have you do today. First thing is that you should all, oh, did I not load the lab exercise up? I'm going to have to, I'm not seeing the lab, GUI dev lab.pdf. Yes, I did. So you have a file out there, and it is called if you've downloaded today's zip file, it will say GUI dev_lab1.pdf. And these are the lab exercises that we have for you today. And I just wanted to quickly walk through and kind of give you an idea of what you're going to be doing. So we start by going, you're going to start with exercise 1. This is preparing your lab environment. So it's going to be having you download an open lab-base.zip, which is also included in that bundle I gave you. Sorry, my phone's going off at home. Once that lab-base.zip is downloaded and you open it up, you're going to extract it to a directory such as this d.ui.class. In my example, I've actually downloaded it to aui.class because I want it to appear at the top of my directory structure. Follow these instructions. It's going to have you open the project. The step 2, it has you adding the FGL profile. So let me just, it's going to have you go inside of a class node, and it's going to give you instructions for adding an FGL profile. You need to do this in order for it to find the database. So to find, so we give you the instructions that are going to guide you through in adding this environment variable to the class, so your FGL profiles, finding the correct FGL profile, and when it comes time to use the databases, we're going to actually find the databases we need to find. So all of that is just set up, getting it set up. Then exercise 2 is using an editable display array. Part of what we gave you in a package is we gave you an input array, and we're going to have you modify it to use a display array. So you're going to have an input array. You're going to modify, you're going to remove this input array, and you're going to add the code to make a display array happen. If you want to do other things like changing the array so it's a dynamic array, which is what we tend to use, you can do that. But the solutions that were provided for you, I believe, are just keep to the instructions, and you're going to put in the display array to take place of the input array. So go ahead and run your input array first, see how that works, and then go and change it, follow these instructions to create your display array. You're going to add a delete validation by using the FGL_win question. And then you'll add the double click so that you can update using the double click. You'll test out the find and seek features, make sure they work, I believe, and then, yeah, the Control F and Control G are the default. They're going to have you go in and create your own action default file. Make sure you use your own action default file. They're going to have you change your accelerators from Control F to Control S for your find action and test that out. They're going to have you add an action default to the form so that the form overrides your default.4AD. And that's the lab that we have set up for you today. If you want to, after that, if you want to go and if you want to try, let me see if my PowerPoint, if you want to go and you want to try to create a file that's named something other than default.4AD and then use this call interface method to load it up, I would recommend doing that as well, just for the practice of loading in, and then you know you're explicitly using this file. You're not going off and using a default file sitting somewhere. As I said earlier, I am here to help you throughout the day. If you have any questions, let me find that overhead again. Let me open up my day 1, module 1. Put up again my phone number. Oops, wrong thing. And so up here we had my information. So I'm here to help you throughout the day with any of the labs. Let's see, will these labs work with both GDC and GWC? Okay, a couple questions out here. Let me answer. So first, I have the information up here. So email me, call me if you have any questions. If we need to share screens, I'll launch a GoToMeeting to help. So first question, will these labs work with GDC and GWC? The answer is yes. And but you can actually try these things. Down here you'll see, let me actually stop my application. So I'm going to quit, cancel, get out of that. Right now we've been working with the desktop, but you can see down in my configuration, I can switch it to work with the web. This web is, we're not using the gas. This is something set up to work inside of Studio. If I execute this application now, executing a display array, let me see, boom, okay. And I have windows everywhere. Let me pull this over. There it is, my editable display array sitting out there inside of a browser. So all I did was switch it from using the desktop configuration to using the web configuration. This has been automatically set up for you. So you should be able to kick it off, and here you can see everything happening inside of my web browser view. Click out, it ends my application. Are there any problems with the browser capturing some of the special keys? Yes, there are. With the browser, sometimes the browser has keys defined for it that are going to take precedence over the keys that you've defined. So if there's a key defined that's already hooked into your browser, then you're not going to be able to override it with setting things up in the action default. And that's something just in general dealing with that web applications. People that are very used to using hotkey combinations, when they move over to displaying it all through a browser, sometimes the browser takes precedence. And that's, I don't know if you can disable it on the browser level, but we've just found that hotkeys tend not to be used as much when we're dealing with the web clients because of issues like this. People are just used to clicking around. Okay, let me unmute your lines. We'll give this a try and see if there are any other questions or anything else I can answer for today. Okay, I have you all unmuted. Are there any other questions? You can type them in or you can ask them out loud. Okay, I don't see any questions happening right now, so I'm going to go ahead and set you free for the day. You have your lab exercises. Everybody should have been able to download them from our materials section. If you have any issues, with your labs, please don't hesitate to give me a call. And other than that, I wish you a good day, and I will, if I don't hear from you today, I will talk to you tomorrow